Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I thought I'd be doing something a little bit different because I love true crime and I thought I'd bring some of my content towards that side. So today we're going to be doing the case of Ed Gein, a very infamous serial killer, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield. Today's video can be, well, it is quite sensitive because he was, you know, but it mentions of I think abuse is mentioned, obviously murder, is it, I think necrophilia is mentioned, some topics that to do, you get what I'm trying to say. If you're uncomfortable with any of that, click off. I've got some vlogging, I normally do vlogs and stuff, so you will enjoy that. But let's get into it. Ed Gein was born on the 27th of August 1906 in Wisconsin, Plainfield. Now, I thought I'd start off by saying Ed Gein, or also known as the Butcher of Plainfield, is most well known for his morbid obsession with his mum and how that kind of obsession and isolation within his childhood led into this absolute infatuation with women and not being able to maintain relationships, and then in the end cutting up women's bodies and turn them into bull skulls as bowls, making their skin into costumes and masks. Gein was brought up in a small farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, to mother Augusta Gein and George Gein. He also had a brother, I believe his name is Edward. Now, his mother Augusta was a very deeply religious woman. She was rather, could you say, domineering. And I think this heavily influenced Henry and Ed when they were children, because she'd always be telling them these stories and how women were evil and the root of all sin, and almost making her this like ultimate figure, if you know what I mean. I've got a direct quote actually that she was believed to say: "Women are sinful and a cause of all evil." Says enough about her, doesn't it? She loved Ed arguably the most, and she really heavily relied on him, especially later on in life. But throughout childhood, Ed very much relied on her. Not much is known about Augusta's childhood, and I was trying to look into this to try and get some education on how and why she's mainly like this, but I believe she was born 1878 in Wisconsin, into the usual, like a poor rural family, you know, and I think most of our views really stem from just the ideology of the time, you know, like how women didn't have the vote, you know what I mean, until 1929, well, at least in the UK, and it was just very like putting women down, like women. That pretty much says how our ideas were formed, because this conservative Bible interpretation is very like women are evil and sexuality is evil, like the root of everything is your sexuality and women, which is an absolutely insane view. But let's say for the 19th century it probably wasn't absolutely crazy to think this. Talking about this because Augusta's views, which she pushed onto Ed and Henry, especially Ed, really affected his relationships growing up, how he viewed his mom, like how he viewed women in general, and sexuality was very like ooh to it, you know what I mean? And within Ed's household when he was a child and throughout before his dad passed, which was later on in life, Augusta and George really did not have a great marriage, which for the time, once again, wasn't like crazy out the blue, but it really did affect Augusta and her experiences, especially with this root in this ideology being that women are sin. Now, George was an alcoholic. He heavily relied on alcohol, and this put like a big strain, as it would any relationship, on Augusta and George's marriage, because George wasn't helping on the farm, he wasn't helping Augusta, he wasn't doing much because he was constantly drunk. And I think this kind of compelled Augusta to be like, well, men are weak, they can't do anything, I'm gonna have to do it myself. Almost blamed George's behaviour on the indulgence of alcohol and sexual pleasures and stuff, which again fuels this view which was pushed on Ed, which whilst Augusta's influence played a pivotal role on Ed, so did his father George. And George not loads is known about his childhood, similar to Augusta. He was born in 1873, Wisconsin, similar to Augusta and Ed. He was also brought up in a poor farming family, typical of the time in Plainfield, and he was known, from what I picked up, to not really be able to hold any jobs, not be able to have a stable salary, career path because of his alcoholism. It really, really affected all aspects of his life, especially his relationship. It's important to note that George also had he was bad in social situations. He was quite like reserved, do you know what I mean? Like stuff like that, which Ed was also. And George, because he couldn't keep a job because of his alcoholism, because he didn't have a stable income, his family also really struggled because of that, because Augusta was looking after the children, typical of the time, Ed and Henry, and the money was bare because George couldn't keep up a job, which meant his alcoholism worsened, and so did his ability to handle. Now, around 1901, I couldn't find the specific date, George and Augusta got married. Now, the struggles in their marriage have always been from the start. From the start, bang on, ring on it, it did not go well. As I've said, Augusta was very domineering, she was very strict, and she held a firm, what could you say, grip on the household, which kind of created this power imbalance because George was quite quiet, he was dead reserved, whereas Augusta was this big powerful figure that was almost controlling everything. Now this domineering approach it wasn't just Ed this affected. George was also very widely affected by this because of Augusta's authoritarian approach. It meant she was almost like George was very heavily reliant on Augusta, similar to Ed. Because of George's inability to hold jobs, it meant that, and literal inability to do much for the household, Augusta would have to do most of the farm work, most of basically everything, including looking after the house, including looking after their two children, which also made Augusta hate George more. Can you blame her? Augusta had also had negative feelings towards men, don't we all? But this was most likely worsened because of George's behaviour, because of his inability to do literally anything. Prick. But, oh God. Augusta would teach them that men are weak, and this created this warped perspective on like gender roles and relationships, and this really had a lasting impact on Ed, like all of Augusta's other teachers. As I was researching, I feel like, well, I've done extensive research, guys. I don't think much is known about the abuse within the household, but it is likely that Ed and Henry both experienced physical and mental abuse. Because of this abuse he faced, it is also believed that Ed internalized this abuse, which is problematic on top of all of these others mothers' teachings and how these gender roles are all warped and men are weak, but then women are the root of all evil, relationships are, oh, like stay away, and then having this heavy reliance on his mother would make him believe these things even stronger. And due to this tiny little farm and them being so deprived and poor, it just doesn't bode well. And George were born, why do I keep saying George? Henry were born 2 years apart. Henry being the older sibling and Ed being the younger. Now, Ed and Henry basically just had a typical sibling relationship, two brothers living on a very isolated farm, and this played a pivotal role in Ed's childhood, this isolation, this blockage of otherworldly views, because it was so together. And possibly if he had other teachings from, say, literally anything else apart from Augusta, Ed's mum always belittling George and saying how he's crap and he's da-da-da-da-da, it led to Ed's, again, warped views, but he's complete and utter dependence on women and his mum, because if a domineering, strict, authoritarian mum's telling you like, no, men are weak, men are this, and he is saying this because his father's absent, it's this heavily dependence on women. And because Augusta taught that the only women you can trust are godly women, well, women who believe in God, Ed fully and only trusted his mum because he saw her as the root of pureness and just everything. Like the only pure source of love and good was his mum, because if you're not a godly woman, you're evil and you're the root of sin. Now, over time, Ed and George's relationship, not George, Henry, their relationship grew apart a little bit because Henry, even though they had the exact same teachings and the exact same isolation, Henry became more independent. There's the dogs howling. But when Henry went through his teenage years and stuff, he became more sociable, which meant that as he was leaving and going out the house and in school and stuff and talking to girls or whatever he was doing, Ed was at home with his mum, and this isolation grew even stronger because Henry wasn't there to get in the way. Ed never had a girlfriend during this time. He was never out, and he was always still doing his mum's chores. He was helping around the house because he just had this absolute love for her that literally nobody could come close to because she's the root of purity in Ed's eyes. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s attended school in Plainfield. He didn't really have many friends. He was kind of the lonely kid and often got made fun of for looking odd looking. He was often made fun of for being awkward and having a high-pitched voice, and he was described as shy, but kind of he was a bit weird, but he wasn't like mean or anything. He didn't really get involved, and these social interactions kind of just pushed him away from society altogether. He was very distant. He didn't have any friends. He was just all to himself. And then when he went home, he was with Augusta, George and Henry. And as his teenage years rolled around, you can kind of see more signs of him picking up this obsession with death and this obsession with human anatomy. He used to pick up carcasses or roadkill, look around and examine them and have a look, and just this utter infatuation with death really developed in his teenager. Also throughout his teenage years, it's unclear if he practiced, but he became widely obsessed with the occult and looking through witchcraft books and various books about the occult and these sinful things that came along with him examining these bodies. During Ed's teenage years, or possibly early 20s, his father George died of a heart failure in 1940. And this probably was not a shock because of his alcoholism, but this left two boys, Henry and Ed, completely supporting Augusta through this and doing the chores for her, because now George, although he was not much help in the past, was completely gone and there was no help at all for Augusta apart from the two boys. However, although Ed was spending more time with Augusta, Henry's rebellion grew stronger during this period. He started spending less time in the house and going and looking for jobs in the town and the local whatever they were doing. Now, as Ed was left with Augusta's health was deteriorating quite fast, and due to this she became more possessive and controlling over Ed and what he was doing and how he was caring for her, even more than she was before, if that was even possible. Here's where things start to get a little bit weird, because in May 1944, when Ed was 37 and Henry was 39, only 4 years after their father's death, Henry mysteriously passed away on the farm whilst I think he was doing something with the weeds. Ed later discovered the body. I think on the basis it wasn't clear what had killed Henry, but it was a strangulation. And the strange part is that Ed didn't immediately report his brother's death to the police, which anybody would do, considering your brother has just died whilst burning weeds, which is suspicious enough. I don't know why that wasn't more investigated, looked into, but it was the 40s, so. Now, police didn't rule it as strangulation. They ruled it a mysterious or accidental, whatever they would call it, heart attack. Am I the only one that thinks that's weird? Like, come on guys, connect the dots. Later on in this, when I think people were looking back at Henry's death certificate, a lot of inconsistencies were found. One investigator noted that there was bruises around his neck, which could have been from strangulation or bludgeoned. How was it labelled a heart attack? What to note about that? That was apparently there before he was placed, like where he was found, I think, which is also extremely strange, a little bit suspicious. This is heavily speculated, it's my own opinion, just personally my own, but many criminologists have suggested that Ed was directly involved with the murder of Henry in 1944 because he was getting in the way of him and Augusta. He wanted Augusta all to himself, and the fact that Henry was away out gallivanting and doing all these normal teenage things, Ed was like, absolutely not. And then he mysteriously... Now around, I'm just gonna get comfortable, around 5 years in 1945 after Henry's death, these 4 years of, I believe, peace, well, nothing's really peaceful with Augusta, but Ed began grave robbing. Now this grave robbing worsened a lot after his mother's death, which I'll get into after, but this grave robbing really was the start of Ed's criminal action. Now, it's unknown whether the grave robbing was around the time of his mother's death or just before, when her health was really deteriorating, because Ed particularly targeted the graves of women who had just been freshly buried, and these were all women, and they were believed, it is believed that he picked them out because they resembled his mum, and this deep infatuation he wanted to almost embody her. This carried on for however long, possibly a few months, until tragedy really struck for Ed, as his mum was his absolutely everything. It was his world. He loved her more than literally anything else. She was the source of purity for him, and she passed away in 1945. When his mother passed, he was already grave robbing, trying to embody his mum, so obviously this got 10 times worse. For this Ed, it was the end of his world. Nothing was worth living for without his mum, and it just shit hit the fan. Now this desire to reconnect with his mum really was rooted in this grave robbing. He was digging up these women, trying to almost get his mum back, but these women were never ever going to be his mum. And it is definitely clear that this need to become a woman, when he would later dress up as women with the skin of his victims, horrific, the skin of his victims, because he wanted to be a woman, and this is because of his loss of his mum. He deeply needed her. He relied on her so much, and she was gone. He would dig up these graves from Plainfield Cemetery, which was only, I think, a few miles away from his home, not long at all, and at night he would go with his shovel and he would dig them all up, take them back to his house, and make sure it was all neat again. Some also believe this grave robbing also stemmed from Augusta's teachings about sexuality, and Ed was probably interested in that, and so he was digging up these bodies to just see a woman and see what it was like. In a way, it's kind of hard to describe because it's just like, it's so incredibly warped, but in Ed's head it made sense. He was seeing these women and he almost had like control over them, like his mother Augusta did, just in my words. Because he couldn't have this control within relationships, he could have control over these women who literally couldn't do anything because they were dead. He could do anything he wanted with them, but he couldn't do that in a real life, actual living, breathing woman in a relationship. Now, the exact number of graves that Ed robbed is unknown, but it's estimated to be around 9 to 15, which is absolutely insane. Now, this is where it gets a little bit sensitive, because you can obviously gather that if you're grave robbing and you're trying to get this deep possession and control over women who have passed, what he was doing with these bodies was extremely horrific and absolutely disgusting. So if you just want to leave, do so, because it gets worse. So Ed would skin these dead women's bodies and then take out their organs and use them to create various objects in his home. The objects, prepare yourselves. So, such as furniture, clothing, like women's suits, masks, and this was almost to dress up as his mum, pretended that he was his mum, pretend his mum was there with him, with this skin of, like, he would literally, like, a woman's face, and he would just chop it off and make it into a mask, which is sick. And that wasn't all. He would also get their body parts and display them, almost to look at them, keep them as possessions, be like, I don't know, like, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a trophy, it's more of this, like, infatuation, this, like, need to know more and just have it there and feel comfortable that it's there. At least that's what I think. But, like, now, during this time, around the late 1940s to 1950s, Ed really spiraled into a mental depression. He really, really was not doing well. This is probably the lowest point in his life, as the grave robbing was. It's known / believed that he had a psychological breakdown because his inability to cope with his mother's loss, and he literally couldn't do anything to bring her back, even when he was exhuming these women's bodies and trying to replicate them and turn them into masks. And he would begin beheading these bodies that he'd exhumed and replicating these women, his mum, and really trying to become her. That's where this really, really stemmed from, this psychological breakdown and this inability to cope with these mum being gone. Now, by this point, he hadn't actually committed any murder. Although he'd committed crimes with the grave robbing, he hadn't actually killed anybody yet. But that changes in 1954 with Ed's first murder of Mary Hogan. Mary was a well-known owner in Pine Grove. She operated a small tavern and was visited very frequently. Many people went, and she was independent, she was headstrong, and I believe she was 51 and she was divorced, and her tavern was located not far from Ed's farm, which was easy access for Ed, sadly. Now, on the afternoon of, I think it was December 8th of 1954, Ed shot Hogan with a 32 Mauser pistol, and after this he simply threw her into his truck, an utter disregard for her life, and just drove her back to his shed at his farm, which is... Now, I couldn't find much about what Gein did with Hogan's body after, as Hogan was you could say there's not as much information on Hogan's murder rather than the later murder that Ed committed. But when police eventually searched Gein's home, like I was saying, as they searched Gein's home, they found Hogan's face on skull caps that he'd made, which is... Now, after the murder of Mary Hogan, he later went on to murder a woman called Bernice Warden, I believe that's how you say her name, I don't know, but... She was again very hardworking and friendly, and she owned a hardware store near Ed, and she was very, very well known in the community. Similar to Mary Hogan, both owning shops and quite independent and just overall good people. I'd just like to note that there isn't much reason on why Ed chose these two women, because they were both absolutely lovely women and really outgoing members of the community, but there's not really a reason for why Gein chose these two women. Probably just convenience for him, which is absolutely awful to say, but it's the truth. Now, on November 16th of 1957, the body of Bernice Warden was found shot and decapitated after Gein had robbed her hardware store. Just need a moment, because just understanding how much of a horrific man he was. Now, making an educated guess, I can say that before I get into how Gein was caught and how these events all came to light, was that similar what he did with the grave robbing, he most likely did with the bodies, making them into faces, keeping their body parts as trophies, trying to embody Augusta, his ma. So gather what you will. Now, Ed made a crucial mistake here, because Bernice Warden's son was, there's Getty's name, Frank Warden. Now, Frank Warden was a sheriff, and after Bernice was not answering him, he couldn't find her anywhere, he grew extremely suspicious of where she may be, so he checked and realised that the last individual to go into Bernice's shop was Ed Gein. So he quickly notified authorities, and then the authorities went and searched his home. And rightfully so, immediately Gein was taken into investigation. He was interrogated, and quickly he admitted to everything. He had literally admitted to everything. He admitted to the grave robbings, he admitted to both the murders of Hogan and Bernice Warden, everything, even the mutilation of the bodies and cutting up the body parts and eating out of them and dressing up as his mum. And obviously from this, the police gathered that there was no way really that Gein was ever going to be able to face trial, because his psychological state was so horrific and so distorted that there was no way he could be faced with a criminal trial. Now, a standard procedure during this time, Gein was evaluated by a mental health specialist and was found to not be fit for trial, which was really not much of a surprise. And then in 1957, after all these evaluations, Gein wasn't actually found guilty for the murder of Hogan, but was of Bernice Worden. I don't know if he was, I might do some more research, I don't know if he was actually thingied for the grave robbers and stuff, but even so, he was still going to go to a mental institution and face the rest of his life there. He was never going to face prison, which personally, I'm just saying, I'm not putting my views on anybody else, I think he should have been locked up forever or given the death sentence, because although he was extremely troubled, in my opinion, what he did to those women, it's just unfathomably horrific. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he would receive treatment for his psychological issues. Whether they worked, I don't know, but he did end up spending the rest of his life there. Like I said, in his later years, he never faced a conventional criminal, sentence, but he did receive treatment, which I hope helped him work through his issues with his mum. But when something's so deep-rooted, there was probably not that much hope. And then in 1984, at the age of 77, due to cancer, Ed Gein passed away. Probably for the best. Not just my opinion. Now, that is the end of the Ed Gein case. I'd also just like to say, I think he inspired the Silence of the Lambs, I think, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre loosely, various huge big films, because he's quite a well-known serial killer. But I hope you enjoyed this video. It was very different. I had to keep checking my notes, so there's gonna be, I think I've got like 100 clips here. So, but yeah, also I'm thinking I might make, if this does well, I might make a separate channel for this true crime stuff, because I absolutely love doing it. This true crime stuff and me vlogs in there. But I don't know. So it's up to you. Like, comment and subscribe.